Hi everyone. Tonight's story is called I've Hardly Slept at All, and it's by Trevor Byrne. It had snowed heavily during the night, covering Offaly, all of Ireland, and Helen could hear Martin, her husband, dressing in the dark. It was 5 in the morning, and by 9 Martin would be back in London, having travelled on the small bus from their house in the countryside to Edenderry, and on the coach from Edenderry to Dublin, and on the 8 o'clock Aer Lingus flight from Dublin to Heathrow, and finally to the office of O'Neill Associates, where he'd speak to the senior partners, possibly even to Harry O'Neill himself. And by 10 o'clock they'd know if all this travelling to and from London could end. "Helen," said Martin, and she turned away from him, pretending she was asleep. She felt the bed shift and the warmth of Martin's breath as he leaned over her and kissed her shoulder, and Helen thought she would say something then, or reach out for him, but didn't. She heard him move about the house, heard him switch the bathroom light on, and the brief hissing of the taps before the light was switched off again. Heard him whisper to their daughter, and Lizzie mumbling in a small, angry, sleepy voice. Heard his footfalls on the stairs, a chair scrape in the kitchen. It was too much to hope for that the meeting might go well, that there might be new investors, or the economy would rally, and these distant, unfathomable things would bring Martin home for good. If the Dublin office reopened, there'd be no more long weeks apart, with Helen and Lizzie in the big isolated house in Offaly, and Martin in the little bed and breakfast in London. There'd be no more brief weekends together, rushed and anxious like the last days of a holiday. No more lying awake in the dead hours of Monday, waiting for Martin to leave, worrying in the dark about the mortgage, if he could handle the way things were, if it meant anything that he didn't shave unless she told him to, that he didn't read anymore. Helen heard Martin cough and clear his throat, loud in a silence she had never known before, coming from the city, from Dublin. She saw the shadow of falling snow past the slats of the blinds. It was too much to hope that the Dublin office would reopen, but at 10 a.m. they'd know. Helen closed her eyes. She wouldn't go to him. She wouldn't go to the kitchen and talk of all her hopes for better. She'd wait for his call from London. She might have slept for longer, slept past 10 and Martin's call if not for Lizzie. Helen opened her eyes, panicked that she'd slept at all, and saw Lizzie kneeling at the end of the bed in her pyjamas, slapping the duvet with her palms, nodding her head, humming. "Hey, honey," said Helen. Lizzie was 5. She smiled and hummed a little louder. They went downstairs together, Lizzie in front and Helen following in her old pink housecoat and worn-out slippers. Helen made a breakfast that Lizzie, who loved the snow and was wild with excitement, wouldn't eat. "You can't stay out for too long now, okay?" Lizzie nodded and stamped the mat impatiently as Helen buttoned up her red duffel. Helen was tired. Whatever sleep she'd had wasn't enough. She felt guilty too for having ignored Martin for her pettiness. "You have to come back in soon and warm up, and then you can go back out, okay?" The key in the back door wouldn't turn. It was already unlocked. Martin must have been out there to check on the back gate or use the recycle bins. Lizzie ran into the garden, straight to the wood, or the small part of it that was theirs. The people who owned the house before them must have sectioned off a bit of the woods for themselves and taken a few of the trees to build a fence. Their nearest neighbours were a 10-minute walk in either direction, and because of the snow, it was hard to see where the garden ended and the countryside began. Everything seemed connected, even the Slieve Bloom Mountains. Usually she'd go out with Lizzie, but she hadn't the energy. She'd keep an eye on her from the window, and anyway, she knew she couldn't go far. Helen sat on a stool by the window and took out her phone. She rang Martin's number, but her call was connected to his voicemail. "Hey, Martin, I'm sorry I didn't get up with you this morning. I was knackered. Hope the plane was okay. Lizzie's out in the snow already. Let me know how you got on. She opened the window and lit a cigarette, watching the snow fill Lizzie's footprints. When she thought she'd smoked half the cigarette, she looked at it, took a quick final pull and flicked it into the snow. Helen set the ringtone volume on her phone to full and placed it on the window ledge. Lizzie, honey, come on. Time to come in. It's too cold in the snow. After a minute, Lizzie stepped out from behind one of the trees. She looked in Helen's direction, and Helen raised her hand. Lizzie looked up at the falling snow and then made her way slowly to the house. There was a large, sleek crow on one of the fence posts. When Lizzie reached the door, her cheeks were red and snow had settled in her ringlets. Where's your bobbin? Your hair's come loose. Lizzie shrugged. Were you playing with the fairies in the ring? A snowflake landed on Lizzie's eyelash and she blinked and batted on her face. Come on inside, love. You have to let your hands warm up again. Helen ushered Lizzie past her and into the hall, then into the kitchen. She tried to catch her daughter's eye. I'll make you a big girl sandwich with chicken and crunchy lettuce, said Helen. Take them boots off. Lizzie sat on the kitchen floor. The kitchen was big and clean, with new units and a breakfast bar and a big wide window that looked out onto the mountains. Can you get them off yourself, or do you need me to help you? Lizzie said nothing. Helen turned and looked out into the back garden. Lizzie's footprints were almost gone and the tops of the sleeve blooms were blurring with the low, heavy sky. When Helen turned around, Lizzie was standing in her orange socks next to her empty boots. Good girl, she said. Lizzie nodded and wiped her red nose with the back of her hand. She looked at Helen and blinked, then looked at her boots. It was unusual for her to be so quiet. Hungry? Lizzie half nodded. Want to watch a video? She nodded again. Say yes, said Helen, but she'd said it too quickly, too harshly. Lizzie looked at her with her eyes narrowed. What's the matter? Lizzie looked at the floor, and Helen took her hand and squeezed it gently and rubbed it between her own as they walked into the living room at the front of the house. Helen put on The Princess Bride, Lizzie's favourite film, and then went back to the kitchen. They'd been in the house for months and there were still boxes under the window full of Helen's books. She told Martin to leave the unpacking to her, that it'd give her something to do. But she kept thinking that if she opened the last box, that was it. They'd moved in and there was no going back. But of course there was no going back to Dublin now anyway, to their little rented flat near St. Stephen's Green, not far from Martin's own old office. Helen started on Lizzie's sandwich. She missed having her parents nearby and meeting Martin's sister Adele for breakfast in the cafe they liked. It wasn't long after they took the flat that Martin started working with O'Neill Associates. They'd hired Martin and a man from Cork, Sean Dowling. He'd been to the flat a few times, a tall, good-looking man with a deep line between his eyebrows that he sometimes rubbed at with his finger when he was listening. The company wanted two young architects with new ideas, with an intuitive feel for original forms. That was what they'd said to Martin at the interview. They lived in the flat for a little over 3 years. It was only when Lizzie started walking that Helen saw how small the flat was. It was tiny, really. They could have stayed a while longer, but the bigger Lizzie got, and she was so mobile, so daring, she'd make steps out of Helen's books to get at things, and they were on the 4th floor. They started to look for somewhere else, for a house, but there was nothing they could afford in the Dublin area, except a few houses in estates like the one Helen grew up in, places where drugs were creeping back in, and neither of them wanted Lizzie growing up somewhere like that. She viewed a few houses on her own, taking Lizzie with her while Martin was at work, knowing before she turned up that they could never afford them. Nodding her head and saying yes, very nice, lovely, I'll have to speak to my husband. He's an architect. But yes, it's gorgeous, just what we're looking for. It was Adele who suggested looking outside of Dublin. She'd meant well, of course, but Helen rued taking her advice. She brought the sandwich to Lizzie on a plate with a glass of milk. She leaned down and kissed Lizzie's head and walked to the doorway, then turned and looked back. Lizzie was sitting with the plate on her lap and her feet in their orange socks, not touching the floor, and she was looking around the room, not paying attention to the film. "Make sure you eat it all now, love," said Helen. Lizzie nodded, but said nothing. Helen sat on the stool by the window, watching the snow, ignoring the clock on the wall behind her. When she looked, it was 10:20. She waited another 5 minutes before ringing, but the call went through to Martin's voicemail again. "Hey, you love, just checking in. Hope everything's okay. I'm watching the snow here. Lizzie's watching The Princess Bride again. Love you." She couldn't bring herself to mention the meeting or the Dublin office. She could hear Lizzie's film from the front room as she made herself a cup of tea. Lizzie's footprints were gone now, and the sky very low and pale. The meeting might have run over. They often did. But she was worried that Martin hadn't texted her even to say that the flight was okay, or that it was snowing in London, or that it wasn't snowing there at all. It was freezing but clear, bright. He'd never have done this when they lived together in the flat, but things were different now, different to how they'd been before they moved, before the trouble with Martin's job. She missed how close they'd felt when all three of them were bunched up in the flat with their books stacked against the walls, big hardbacks at the bottom and smaller paperbacks at the top. She even missed the old couple who owned the flat, Dr. Abushi and his tiny frail wife. Dr. Abushi spoke to Helen about Palestine. He'd sit on the armchair by the window with his smooth dark hands on his knees and ankles touching, his feet together. Most of his relatives still lived in Gaza, he said, and though it was dangerous, it wasn't all bad. There was still an olive harvest every year, and God was good. Helen never told Dr. Abushi that she didn't believe in God. Lizzie passed in the hallway wearing her duffel coat and hat. "Lizzie!" Helen heard Lizzie opening the back door, and a few seconds later saw her through the window lifting her legs high like before as she marched through the snow. She was carrying the red woolen scarf Helen had bought Martin before Christmas, before the weather turned bad. The doorbell rang. Helen sat still for a moment, forgetting what she should do next, then put her tea down and walked to the front door, glancing into the living room as she went. The film was playing and Lizzie's sandwich was on the sofa, untouched. The doorbell rang again. Helen could see two blurry shapes through the glass, and she took a breath and tucked her hair behind her ears, then opened the door. There was a young man and woman standing in the porch. The woman had short ginger hair and the man was blonde. Their footprints led up the long drive. Both wore heavy coats. Helen noticed that the man was holding a leather briefcase and felt a stab of panic. "Hello," said the woman, smiling. "Are we disturbing you?" The man smiled too and shifted his feet. The man and woman were Jehovah's Witnesses. By the time they were in the kitchen and Helen was standing by the countertop and the man and woman were sitting at the table, glossy leaflets arranged in front of them, Helen had forgotten their names. They were smartly, formally dressed, and Helen was still wearing her old housecoat and the slippers with no heels. The man wore a shirt and a purple tie, and the woman wore a dark ankle-length skirt and flat blunt shoes. Their overcoats were hanging over the backs of the kitchen chairs, and the snow was beginning to melt. They were probably in their 20s, but their clothes and their practiced, unflagging smiles made them seem ageless. It was hard to picture them anywhere but in other people's kitchens. "Would you like a cup of tea?" asked Helen. "Coffee would be lovely," the man said before turning his attention to the leaflets, pushing them around the table, weighing up which leaflet would suit Helen best. "Coffee for me too, thanks," said the woman, smiling. Helen placed her hands on the countertop behind her and did her best to smile too. She glanced out the window and saw Lizzie's footprints in the snow. "It's a God-given gift," said the man. He was appraising the room, nodding. "A house like this, I mean. It's a gift." "You mustn't be here long," said the woman, looking at the boxes stacked along the wall. "No, not long," said Helen. She hadn't told them that she didn't believe in God, and now it was too late. And she hadn't told them that she wasn't happy in this house, and she'd rather be back in her old flat in Dublin. And that if it wasn't for the price of property, she wouldn't be here, and she'd never have met them, and she'd be happier. "It's grand and private out here," said the woman. "Yes," said Helen. The man tapped one of the leaflets, and the woman glanced at it and nodded. They were shameless, because they were young and sure, and thought they had her, that they'd saved her. Helen turned away and clicked the kettle again to boil the water for tea. And then she remembered that it was coffee they wanted, and that she didn't know how to work the new coffee maker. She didn't drink coffee, and neither did Martin. The expensive coffee maker had been a present from someone. She felt her face heat with embarrassment and leaned on the countertop. She felt faint. She wanted to call Martin. "Is everything okay, Helen?" It was the woman speaking. Helen wished she could remember her name. That would help things, even things up. She didn't turn round to face her, though. Instead, she nodded, though she wanted to slide down against the counter and sit on the floor. "Are you sure?" said the woman. Helen nodded again. "I'm sorry, I've run out of coffee," she said, and it felt strange to speak to someone without looking at them. Why couldn't she turn around? It seemed impossible to tell them the truth now, to face them. "I haven't been to the shops because of the snow," she said. She kept her hands on the countertop and tried to think of something else to say, but the only thing she could think to ask them was if they thought her husband was okay, if the plane had taken off and landed safely. Maybe if she'd stood for long enough with her back to these nameless, ageless people who admired her home and appraised her openly, then, when she turned around, they'd be gone and Martin would be there, and she'd say she was sorry for not getting out of bed, for not saying goodbye. "Are you all right?" asked the man. Helen knew she should tell them she was fine, but though she was lonely, she wanted them to leave. She closed her eyes for a few seconds, took a breath, and when she turned round smiling, she saw that the man and woman were looking at her and smiling still, though now they looked quickly at each other, and she knew that they'd spoken but hadn't used words. The man swiped together the leaflets that laid out and tapped them in his briefcase, and the woman stood. The man packed the leaflets into his briefcase, all except one, which he handed to Helen. She took it, and he looked around the kitchen again, peering into the corners of the room. They walked together down the hallway to the front door. "You should visit our church one of these Sundays," said the man. "You'd be very welcome." "It's near the big roundabout," said the woman, "near the Tesco in town. It doesn't look like your typical church. We don't have a steeple." The woman smiled and touched Helen's hand. Helen didn't want to be touched, and yet she wouldn't stop her. If the woman had stayed standing in the porch, her hand on Helen's arm, her and the man smiling in their professional way as the snow fell about them, Helen would have done the same, unable to do anything else. But after a long moment they turned away, and Helen stood with the leaflet held in front of her against her chest and watched them make their way down the driveway, arms linked. It was almost midday. Helen could hear Lizzie rummaging upstairs, her footsteps, the sound of the drawers opening and closing. She was smoking by the window and watching the snow falling. It was wilder now. She wondered if she should ring the office, or maybe even the Old Canaries, Martin's bed and breakfast. It wasn't far from the office, and Martin sometimes had his lunch there. Helen and Lizzie had stayed with Martin for a weekend, in his small room, not long after he took the London job. The Old Canaries was owned by two brothers from Norwich who had never married. The younger of the brothers had had a bad stammer. When he struggled with a word, the older brother waited patiently, nodded slowly, knowing that the word would come. Helen could hear Lizzie coming down the stairs in her slow, deliberate way, holding onto the banisters and putting one foot down, then following with the other. She stood in the doorway wearing her duffel, and she was holding Martin's red woolen hat. "What are you doing with Daddy's hat?" Lizzie sat and placed the hat beside her and started pulling on her boots. "Are the fairies helping you build a snowman?" "It's very cold," said Lizzie. Helen nodded, glad to have heard her daughter speak. "Yep," said Helen. She took Lizzie's hand and slipped on her woolen mittens, fetched the bobble hat that was hanging in the hall, and pulled it tight over Lizzie's ear. "Nice and snug," said Helen, smiling. But Lizzie looked hurt, and Helen hugged her out of fear, out of sheer lack of ideas, and then stepped back and looked at her. She led Lizzie to the hall, opened the back door, and immediately felt the cold. Lizzie let go of Helen's hand and left her side, walked past her into the garden and through the snow, back to the wood. Helen left the door open. She felt weak and deeply tired, and the cold might keep her awake. On the countertop was the leaflet the Jehovah's Witnesses had given her. It was called "Would You Like to Know the Truth?" and there was a picture of a sunset over still water. She folded it and put it into the drawer with the takeaway menus, then took it out again and dropped it into the paper bin. Helen took out her phone and looked at the number from Martin's desk at O'Neill Associates for a long time, then selected it, listened to the phone ring, and then to Martin, her husband, saying that he wasn't at the desk at the moment, but please leave a message or call back. She was shaking when she selected Andrea Simpson's number. "O'Neill Associates, Andrea speaking. How can I help you?" A southern English accent, placeless. They'd met when Helen and Lizzie visited. She was the office receptionist, young and clever, dark-skinned. "Hello." "Hello," said Helen. "I'm looking for Martin Sheridan." "Can I ask what?" "Hello, Andrea. This is Helen, Martin's wife. We've met. You met my daughter." "Helen. Yes, I remember. We've been..." "Lizzie's 5 now and she asks about you sometimes. She thinks you look like Halle Berry. She asks Martin to..." "Helen, we've been trying to get in touch with Martin. He hasn't been in yet." "Okay, thank you. Helen, we'd like to..." Helen pulled on her boots and wrapped the housecoat tight around her and stepped into the snow. Her breath came in frosted bursts, and she felt the cold in her ears, could hear her heart beat. She began to panic. "Lizzie," she shouted. She could taste the morning's tea on her breath. "Lizzie." The house was coming down heavily, swirling. She walked quickly, her hands pressed to her stomach. Beyond the trees, the mountains were huge, long and low like a pale wave. The crow was still sitting on its fence post watching her. As she passed, it squawked and flew, its call blunted by the weight of the weather, the huge silence. Helen stepped over the broken branches and leafless bushes at the edge of the wood, passed between the trees in the dim light. She saw Lizzie walking through the trees towards her and called her name. Lizzie stopped and looked at her, 20 feet away. "Where's Daddy's hat, honey?" Lizzie looked back the way she'd come. "Did you leave it back there? Are you making a snowman?" Helen was shivering. It wasn't just the cold. It was all she could do not to scream. "Lizzie!" "I put the hat and scarf and gloves on Daddy because it's cold." She said it sullenly, sulkily. "Honey, what do you mean? Tell me what you mean." "Daddy's asleep in the cold." Helen ran to her and Lizzie looked shocked, as though she might be hit. But she'd never hit her daughter. She'd never hurt her. And Helen picked her up and ran, crouching beneath the lower branches, her daughter's face against her neck. "He's very cold, Mummy," said Lizzie. The world around her was not the world at all, or not any world she knew. In a few more steps, she was in the open, in the fairy ring. The small clearing covered with snow and the snow falling heavily about her. Helen walked to the middle of the clearing, then stopped and turned slowly in a circle. She was no longer shivering, no longer frightened or cold. She couldn't go on. She would never, she thought, move from this spot. If she stepped forward or turned back, the world would slip away from her. Lizzie, she could feel her daughter's deep, slow breathing, was suddenly sleeping, and Helen felt she was alone in a far country. Perhaps, she thought, the world might stall. Perhaps she would will it to be so, and there would be no more moving any more, no thinking or feeling. She would stay where she was, and time would stand still, and she would never see Martin, her husband, who was young and beautiful and who she loved. She would never see Martin dead in the snow. But it was beyond her will, and she felt what mastery she had, what grace she'd been granted slipping from her, and she began to shake, her legs and arms and jaw, and a sound came up from deep within her, from a place older and truer than God, a sound that filled the world and felled the trees and cracked the mountains, goes on and on. It will never stop. Good night, everybody, and stay safe.